What Donald Trump has said about lynching is despicable.
For President Trump to compare a constitutional process of impeachment to the white supremacist murder of Americans is, there are no words for how wrong that is.
How dare he? How dare he? And yet again, it is an example of Donald Trump having no appreciation for the history of this nation, for which he is now the commander-in-chief.
Do they know about Joe Biden? 2020 Democrats going after President Trump for his Twitter. Again, this time for calling the House impeachment inquiry a lynching. Republicans and Democrats, some of them agreed that that was not the right word. And then, of course, presidential candidate Joe Biden criticized President Trump, but then was forced to apologize for saying the same word in 1998 when President Clinton's impeachment came to light. Watch.
Even if the president should be impeached, history is going to question whether or not this was just a partisan lynching or whether or not it was something that, in fact, met the standard, the very high bar that was set by the founders as to what constituted an impeachable offense.
Other Democrats used that term back then as well, including Congressman Jerry Nadler and Senator John Kerry. Biden then took to Twitter himself, and I caught this late yesterday. This wasn't the right word to use, and I'm sorry about that. Trump, on the other hand, chose his words deliberately today in his use of the word lynching and continues to stoke racial divides in this country daily. Power panel now. Syndicated radio host and Fox News contributor Leslie Marshall. Syndicated radio host Lars Larson. Leslie, you know, this is complicated for Joe Biden. I mean, you got the Ukraine situation, and now you've got this in terms of he's pointing a finger at somebody, but then has to apologize for his own past.
You know, Harris, I talked about this yesterday on my show, and although I allow everyone to call my show, I specifically asked my African-American listeners to call in so that I could get their take on it. And overall, what they said is, look, and I agree with them, it's wrong to make this comparison. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, and it doesn't, it's just, you cannot have a political situation with that word, what it means and what it still means and what people still do to this day. But the difference for some African-American voters were that, one, this was then and now, two, that Joe Biden apologized, and that many Republicans were saying, maybe you're wrong use of words, but he did it. Maybe you're wrong use of words, but he said it. And passing the buck almost in a childish manner. And a lot of people were upset with that. And the polls actually bear that out as well. African Americans, just 2 weeks ago, Associated Press poll, it shows that African Americans feel that the president is not.
Did he apologize back then, Leslie? Did the former Vice President Biden apologize back then, or do we just have him on record in his tweet apologizing yesterday? It matters, because if you look at history, actually in 1998, you were closer to the lynchings that had happened. And so if you want to talk about some distance, then you would think that the pushback on rhetoric would be less, according to that logic. Lars, she's right about one thing. It's egregious in any account. Joe Biden says, but this president committed something that was deliberate. Well, what was he doing in 98?
Well, Joe Biden was speaking deliberately and calling the impeachment of Bill Clinton a lynching. And in fact, there were a number of Democrats who did. And some of the Democrats who are mentioning history need to go back and read, including Leslie. This is not a word that refers exclusively to the lynching of black Americans, although they were the largest group of people. The largest single mass lynching in American history was Italian Americans in Louisiana. There were German Americans who were lynched. The point is the president is using a political metaphor. He's saying, and just as Joe Biden was, that you have a mob of people demanding that Donald Trump is guilty of something, and like the Queen of Hearts said, we'll convict him now and figure out what he's guilty of later. That is, in fact, a political lynching. There's nothing wrong with the word. And Joe Biden apologizing 21 years later, when his hypocrisy is pointed out, I don't think that kind of apology counts for anything.
So, Lars, I'll push back on you the way that I pushed on Leslie in a different way. I don't think anybody really thinks of lynching as being political, as you say. I think that it conjures a vision and a decade or 2 decades, a section, I should be most fair, in this country of time where people were being lynched. So I appreciate the argument. I'm just wondering if anybody really understands that term. And by the way, that's what Joe Biden was trying to do when he said partisan lynching. I mean, how did this get in there? Leslie, last word.
Except.
Look, to Lars's point, I strongly disagree with what you've just said. I'm sorry. What conjures up to me is a tree and an image, and usually African Americans, mostly African Americans. And secondly, if it's okay to say it now, political lynching, then it was okay to say it then, and I think it's wrong either way, then with Biden, now with the president, now with any Republican or Democrat as well.
It doesn't seem you hold Joe Biden to the same standard, though. Lars and Leslie, I'll bring you back. Well, some new reporting is indicating some Democrats are not that optimistic about their chances in 2020. Three recent headlines, including one from our own Howie Kurtz on FoxNews.com, are saying that some big donors are concerned about the current field, and they wonder if they might need a brand new candidate at this stage of the game. Hillary Clinton, Michael Bloomberg, and Michelle Obama are among the names we're told are being floated. Back to the power panel now. Leslie Marshall, Lars Larson. Lars, I'll come to you first. Are you surprised by this? I mean, they started out with a huge number of candidates. We've whittled down to a dozen to 15 or so. Who's missing?
Well, I go back to the song you and I both remember, Harris. Nothing from nothing leaves nothing. They kind of started out with, as far as I'm concerned, a nothing bunch, and it's now dwindling down to more nothing. And so they're saying, well, who else can we call on? Because they've got a problem. The Republicans are far out fundraising the Democrats, even in the middle of all this fake impeachment nonsense without a House vote. So the Joe Biden's on life support. I think his campaign has $9 million in cash,
yeah, the
which in
money's
campaign terms is nothing. Yeah, they got a big money problem. And bringing back Hillary, one of the worst candidates who's ever run for president, because she's not a great campaigner. Bloomberg, he's an interesting choice. But any of the ones that they bring in show the level of desperation from the Democrat Party. They don't have a good candidate, and Trump's already going to win a year out.
You know, Leslie, this can't be healthy as far as conversation inside the party, right? So who would be floating this information to places like Washington Post and New York Times, and even our own Howie Kurtz is reporting on this?
I would imagine Lars. No, I'm sorry. I don't know, because look, there's a reality. Politics is a numbers game, and the numbers show that the country is and has been for the better part of a couple of decades very divided. It's going to be a very close race, and certainly there is not the enthusiasm for the Democratic candidates on stage that we have seen in the past for a Bill Clinton.
I thought you guys really wanted
Obama.
to beat Donald Trump. You're going to need some enthusiasm. Let me just step in, and I'll come right back to you. Fox News poll from earlier in the month showed Joe Biden and Warren both top Trump by 10 points in a head-to-head matchup. So you've got this kind of polling heading in, and you still don't think you have the right candidates? Leslie?
I didn't say we don't have the right candidates. You guys are saying what other people are.
But the donors in your party are doubtful that you do. And you're going to need money.
What they would feel more comfortable and confident with is having a larger point spread, because they saw Hillary with a larger point spread at this point in the game, and she lost.
Lars, real quickly, your last thoughts.
Yes. I just think that they're in trouble right now, and they decided that the only way they can win is to torpedo the president with an impeachment that they don't have the evidence for. But if they can't take him out with impeachment, they already know whoever they put up is going to lose.
Well, I'm sure they all know that you can only run one candidate at a time against the incumbent. Complicated. Good to see you both. Leslie.